so that you could advocate for the whole state and these ideas on a statewide level. I believe that there's a great vacuum, much like I did in the governor's race, of leaders who will articulate the ideas of limited government and freedom. And much of what I have done has been about how does the government take our money and what do they do with it when they get it. So for all of those reasons, because we've earned some intangible assets that give us a statewide platform and an ability to push these issues on a statewide level, and because so much of what I've done has been fiscal in nature, that the Comptroller's office is, in our view, the best place to be able to continue to wage that battle.
Okay. Movement. Brian, are you asking questions or?
Sure.
You in the mix? Okay.
So you've had a big push for getting rid of the property tax and I guess increasing the state income tax, sales tax. But there's the issue of, different industries and individuals benefit from that shift and get harmed. And would that sales tax, how would that stay local? Because a lot of the property taxes are local. So I guess why picking that method of taxing, and how does that affect the local part of it?
Yeah, and I'm not sure, Brian, that we can say accurately that we picked a method yet. I came to that place believing that private property ownership and gun ownership were the two things that distinguished a free society from one that is not free in all of history, and began to look at how we could more fully own our property in Texas. The property tax, I believe, completely deprives us of true private property ownership, and it creates this lease-tenant sort of relationship. It was fortunate for us, I guess, that the Texas Public Policy Foundation published their study. They've been working on that for years, and they published a study in April of 2009. I started that statewide campaign in February of 2009. But when we looked at that in detail, replacing the property tax with the sales tax, we end up with a lot of revenue in some areas of the state and not enough revenue to be revenue neutral in others, effectively creating a need to Robin Hood local taxes. And that would be antithetical, I think, to any concept of good government that conservatives have. We've got to raise the revenue where the services are provided. So we're now at the table with draft number 2, if you will, of how to go about doing that. The thing that we can say with certainty is the more we looked at the tax code in Texas, the more broken we realized it is. And we believe not just tweaking it, but having to do whole-scale reform is what's necessary. And that's going to be a multi-phase process where we want to make sure that we don't end up Robin Hooding, we don't have the state funding local government, but we create a means that keeps the balance about what it is, about 55, 45, 55% business, 45% individuals, keeping that balance basically the same, while finding a way to have a low, flat, transparent tax structure.
And how
it's not as simple to say it's just a sales tax.
And how does the Comptroller office come into play there?
Well, the Comptroller's office sends a representative to every committee hearing in the legislature when fiscal policy is being discussed, and they're always asked to weigh in. Okay. I've been in many of those hearings, and I think that if we elect people to lead, they need to lead. The Comptroller's got to do more than just show up and say, if you do this, it's $500, and if you do this, it's $250, and I don't have any opinion beyond that. I think we really have to have, I hope to have someone in that office, I'd like to be in that office, advocating the ideas of free markets. These are policies that move us further away from a truly free market, and these are policies that would move us closer to a free market, because the crony capitalism that's going on in Austin right now destroys every benefit of a free market economy. We say we have one, but we don't. We're picking and choosing abatements and credits and exemptions for people, then we're destroying that free market and not being able to be as prosperous as we could be as a state. So I think getting the comptroller to help the legislators understand not just the precise fiscal implication of the policy, but the bigger picture. Is this something that preserves and protects a free market economy, or is it one that moves away, is a role that maybe we haven't seen leveraged or used as much as it should have been.
Yeah.
Okay, kind of following up on that, I'm right on there with you that property tax is not the best way to do it. Some kind of a consumption tax, sales tax. But the sales tax in Texas, from what little I've been able to get some insights, the process for collection is very subject to being escaped. It's not very reliable. It depends totally upon the integrity of the person receiving the sales tax, to report correctly, to distribute to the state, and all that sort of stuff. There's no real audit or follow-up or accountability. So how would you go about, if you did do a shift from property tax to a sales tax, how would you go about improving that to make it a really workable system?
Well, I think the term that you hear in the business is avoidance, tax avoidance. What sorts of tax policies exist where there is a good deal of avoidance? Have you created a black market, an underground market? We certainly have that with the use tax in Texas, where people are supposed to self-report if they didn't pay a sales tax, but they're using something. And that is the cost of collecting that tax exceeds the value that would be received from going out and collecting it. So when we talk about revising or reforming the tax structure, there are several components, and one of them is tax avoidance. Another one is, and I had some interchange already on this, is for people that live around the border, whether it's the border with Mexico or the border with Oklahoma. Will our tax policy drive them across the border to conduct business across the border? And so I think as you see tax reform being discussed, and it's now being discussed, before 2009, all you heard was limiting appraisal caps. Now you actually are hearing some dialogue about eliminating the property tax, and that's good. But I think it's going to have to be broader than that, and we're really going to have to talk about tax reform. There is a mechanism in place, though, at the auditor's office currently, at the comptroller's office currently, to audit businesses. And there is a mechanism in place to go in and do an audit. They should be random, and I don't have the numbers on whether they've slacked off or increased, but you certainly have plenty of businesses who are complaining that the case with Amazon is probably the most notable one, where Amazon said, no, we don't need to collect sales tax, or we're collecting it on these transactions but not on these transactions, and the comptroller goes in and does an audit and says, no, you actually owe the state, because all of these transactions on your book should have been subject to the sales tax and you didn't report and collect that. So that can happen to any business, whether it's a large Amazon or whether it's a small mom and pop, where the comptroller's office can, in fact, Bob Bullock and John Sharp, I think both, Bullock for sure, maybe Carol Strayhorn, shut businesses down, where they walked in and they audited the business and said, you owe us, based on our audit, you owe us this much in sales tax, and if you don't pay, we're going to lock the door. And they chain the door and lock it up and close the business until those cases are settled. So there is a duty by the comptroller to make sure that people are accurately reporting their taxable sales and are collecting and remitting those tax dollars to the state. And that'll be true regardless of the form of tax that's used.
If you'll borrow my pen, just to say so. Let's get a little closer.
Okay.
Well, I was going to ask about something else, but I'm going to go in this, kind of in the same direction as well. Now, the only objection I've heard people give about property tax is the fact that it infringes upon your property rights. And what that's really talking about would be the state's right of seizure, should you not pay your property tax. Now, I'm also president of our Property Owners Association. You know, one of the rules we have is we're not gonna seize anybody's home based on non-payment of dues. You go, oh, you're gonna lose all that money. Not really. Hardly anybody stays in their home more than 5 years, and certainly within 10, there are exceptions, but that's not, the rule is there's a lot of turnover, and it rides with the property, so the next buyer, the title insurance will have to make sure there's money put in escrow, so we'll get our dues. My question is, for something like property tax, if you take away the state's right of seizure, so that really it's only collected, it's required to be collected on a sale of property, so you eventually will get your money. Doesn't that take away the objection to the property tax, or is there still some reason to go with the sales tax or some other tax instead?
Well, you know, as I mentioned, what drove me to that originally was.
Oh, wait, one segue on that. With your position that you take, since the comptroller is considered more of a technocrat, as Ken said, how would you use your position to influence the legislature to examine alternatives?
While I came to this place from a initially purely philosophical one, it doesn't take, you don't have to go very far to find people who believe that their property tax is unfairly levied against them.
As to the amount?
As to the amount, as to the value of the property. And whether or not you can find anecdotal evidence to that, the legislature commissioned the Comptroller's office about 5 years ago to actually audit all of the central appraisal districts in the state. And they divided the central appraisal districts up and audited half of them one biennium and the second half of them just this last biennium, and reported during the 83rd session the results of that audit. Found that 40% of the central appraisal districts in Texas failed the audit. Now, there's a man named John Kennedy who currently works for TATARA, the Texas Taxpayer Association, Research Association, Austin. He helped write the reform of the statute in the 80s when we were trying to get this uniform process. Why does it need to be uniform? Well, because it's the basis for funding public education in Texas. So if we're going to have any sort of equity, then the process by which we determine what's your share and what's your share and what's your share has to be an equitable process. 40% of those districts failed the audit that Mr. Kennedy said nobody could, in good conscience, call an audit. It was so basic that he thought calling it an audit was way overstating. Over half of the districts cannot assign a reproducible value to the property. What does that mean? It means if I say your property's worth $150,000 and you come in and I say demonstrate to me how you got to $150,000, over half the districts in the state can't do that. They can't show you the methodology that they use to reproduce the value. So it's philosophical, but it's also very deeply flawed as a system. And so for those reasons, it needs to be reformed. It gives government control over both the value of the item that's taxed and the rate at which it's taxed. And I think if we do anything, we've got to move to a system where the government only controls the rate. If it controls both variables in that equation, then the people are never really going to have a means by which to limit their government, an effective means by which to limit their government.
Okay, Lauren.
Explain basically the perimeters that the comptroller operates in, and basically what is the basic job of the comptroller, and do you think that there's any overlap from the treasury position?
Well, the comptroller is the treasurer. So what do you mean, is there an overlap?
I know you're over the treasurer, but is there anything that you can cut down on? I mean, is there any areas of duplication?
So the Constitution sets up the office of comptroller, and it's changed some, but to essentially be the chief financial officer of the state, including the officer of the treasury. So within the agency, there is the Texas Safekeeping Trust Company, and the individuals in that section of the agency are charged with investing the assets of the state of Texas that the Comptroller has purview over. So many of our state's assets are managed by boards, the universities in particular and others like that. The Constitution, there's so many ways for me to go, and I'm not sure how. Can I get started over?
I didn't start the call.
Can I get a full 2 minutes to
Somehow
finish?
it got-
Because this is a great question.
Somehow it got stumped.
So you have I don't know which is first. You have responsibilities to administer the statutes that are on the books equitably and consistently. That's one thing that we're hearing from businesses all over the state, from taxpayers all over the state, is that those the administration of the statutes is changing from period to period, quarter to quarter, fiscal year to fiscal year. So the way that I calculated your levy as the state this quarter may be very different, and I didn't give you any warning. As a business, that can be very difficult. So we've got to make sure that you've got processes in place, as any private business would do, to make sure you're consistently laying out what the rules are. How are we going, not that the Comptroller creates law, but the law is written, the Comptroller has to enforce that. How are you going to decide if I paid all of this, if I remitted all the sales tax I was supposed to remit? What process are you going to use? You're going to look at my IRS return? You're going to look at my cash register receipts? What are you going to do, Comptroller, to determine whether or not when I send you a check, you don't come back 6 months later and tell me I owe 50% more than that? How are we going to do that? So you've got a tax collection role. You've got an investment role. Did any of you, that's not a fair question. Should we as a state have moved some of our assets out of Wall Street, off of Wall Street before the housing bubble burst? Or should we have suffered through a 38% loss in our asset value, which is what we did? Should the state of Texas be asking, should the leaders of our state be asking, in the face of global economic uncertainty and an unstable U.S. dollar, are there things that we can be doing as a state to protect our assets? And if there are, what are they? Because waiting for a crash, waiting for that next bubble to burst is a little bit too late to move our assets. And the state of Texas can't be nearly as nimble as an individual can. So are we asking those questions? I don't think we are, and frankly pushed for and got a bill introduced this session that would have created a gold bullion depository system for the state of Texas, because I've been asking that question since 2008. Collection, investments, and then one of the things that we're really starting to dig into is there's a little provision in the Constitution that says the Comptroller may accept federal funds. You think that might be, may not? You think maybe we ought to start standing up as a state and saying those terms are not acceptable? This is our money, but not under those conditions, and pushing our congressional delegation to help us with the terms under which we're getting federal dollars back into our state. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I didn't touch on setting the revenue estimate and certifying the budget, which the Comptroller should not have done, particularly in the 82nd session.
Has there been an issue on which you made a 180-degree turn? Why?
You know, I saw that on your draft questions, and we said yes. I am going to work real hard to answer questions that pertain to the office that I'm running for, and not all of the other ones that people would like to ask of me. Brian is laughing. That was pretty hard. Just last week, I got asked by a reporter in Austin about my position on the life issue. Boy, you don't have to dig very far in my background to know where I am on that issue, but it is not under primarily the purview of the Comptroller's race. And if I pick and choose which ones I'm going to talk about, that's not a good policy either. So I'm going to work real hard because there are important issues that this office needs to be addressing, and that's the conversation that I want to have with voters between now and the election.
Well, let's say as it relates to the Comptroller's office, if you had an opinion on something before and you switched 180 degrees.
Brian, you know me for 10, 15 years. Have I switched? I don't think so. I can't, if I have, I can't think of anything that I have.
Tim?
All right, going back to the investment issue, you talked about the gold repository. What do you think we should be doing right now, given what's going on in the financial markets?
Well, you know, again, I don't know that there's anything Texas can do really, really quickly. I think we need to be asking, what should we be doing? I had really, Giovanni Capriglione carried that bill, and he organized a number of meetings with people in that world. We had really good feedback that that was a very good proposal, very solid proposal, and one that would indeed, it's not just a safe deposit box for our assets, it's a gold depository system so that we can actually have a means of economic exchange. So I then began to say to those people assembled, that's great, this horse is out of the gate, I'm glad y'all all think it's headed down the right track, it needs to pass, what do we need to do next? And one of the gentlemen responded to that we needed to be looking at state banking regulations, and I think there's probably some real opportunity there, but we're far from having refined any proposals in that regard. We get through the primary, and I bet you'll hear me talking about those going into the general. I know that there are a lot of banking interest in Texas who are very concerned about their ability to provide service to their customers. And what we ought to be doing at the state level is making sure that the state has created a climate, a legal climate, where business can happen. Regardless of what's happening in Mexico or Canada or Washington, D.C. or Iraq or Iran, in this, the 14th largest economy in the world, can we continue to do business, and what kind of hedges can we be building around our state so that whatever, you know, catastrophe occurs outside of us, we still can take care of business. So I think the banking regulations are probably pretty low-hanging fruit as well.
So you probably know some of your opponents in this race better than others. You've probably known some for a few years, and probably you just met. What would you say makes you better than your opponents?
I think, you know, I've known Glenn Hager since before he went into office. I was vice chair of the Wharton County Republican Party the first time he ran for state rep. It was when we had a newly created open seat and through a redistricting process. So I know Glenn really well. And I've worked with Harvey Hildebrand during the last two sessions in particular. I had heard of him before, but we developed a working relationship over the course of the last 4 years as I have worked on the tax reform pieces. Both of them, you know, nice men, family men serving the state of Texas. But they've both been in that bubble for quite some time. Harvey longer than Glenn, but Glenn for 10 years, a little over 10 years now. And they are both prone to go along with little incremental pieces of legislation that don't move us towards free markets, that only tend to make the situation, in my view, a little bit more divided. So much of what we've done on fiscal reform has, in my view, made it worse. It's another exemption. It's another, our tax code is worse than the IRS code. I mean, it just goes on and on and on for businesses. We have 63 taxes in Texas. 63 different forms of taxation in the state of Texas that are state taxes, don't have anything to do with federal. If you're a business and you're trying to keep up with that, it's a nightmare. If you're a comptroller and you're trying to collect them, it's probably a nightmare. And rather than, you know, looking at kind of the big picture, we get mired down in the trenches of dealing with that little stuff and not really solving. So I think they're both pretty guilty of voting to make the system work because we've lost sight of what keeps us free and prosperous and what doesn't.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I understood you early on. Now, my view of the Comptroller's office has been that it's not basically a policy organization, but your view is to make it a policy organization to a large degree. I have seen firsthand in my working business, when you have a new management comes in with a very different philosophy, that has some pretty severe impact on the personnel who are part of that organization. So what do you see as the driving issues there, and how are you going to handle those? If you really do make it, convert it into a policy driving organization.
If you look at my professional resume, the first 17 years of my life, I think I probably worked for 6 or 8 different places, because I'd go in as a manager. It'd usually take me about 6 or 8 months to kind of feel like I understood what was happening in that organization, and then began to, I really like operations. I want to see what makes it work. Where do you want this organization to go? Give me about 6 or 8 months to figure out what's making it do what it is. I'm not someone who's want to come in and have heads roll on the first week or 2 or 3 weeks. I want to really kind of see where we are. I've developed in many ways that working relationship with folks at the Comptroller's office already. I picked up the phone and called John Helleman, who's the Chief Revenue Estimator, and Debbie Cartwright, who works in and testifies before the legislature on school property tax things. These folks are very receptive, and I think are hearing and seeing some leadership from me that they're hungry for. There's a lot in Austin. Of course, you never really know whether what you hear on the street is a true reflection of what's going on. But I certainly am hearing a lot that the morale there is suffering. They are looking for somebody to defend the agency, to give them some pride in what they do. Tax collector can't be a fun job, you know? But it's such a critical part of keeping us all playing fair, getting along with one another, and keeping government doing what it's doing. So it's first got a job to do, but I think in addition to doing that job, it's got to be an advocate for good, strong tax policy. When the agency is doing that, everybody that works there will feel good about what it's doing, and the public and the legislature will be served in the way that they should be.
We've only got about 13, 14 minutes left.
Okay, James?
Well, now I realize you don't set this particular issue, but of course in your position as comptroller, you certainly would be influential with any assessment that you make and in any position that you would take. But regarding the oil and gas tax royalties that go to the state, or the rainy day fund, initially, well, you know, legislatively, I guess it can be used for whatever they want to use it for, but at least, well, but what they should be using it for, from what they tell us, would be for disaster relief or something along that order. Or I've also heard it used as a basis for the state's credit rating. So my question is, how much do you think should stay in the rainy day fund? Should it be a dollar amount, a percentage? And then what would be valid reasons for rating a rainy day fund?
Dale Kramer,
Education or what?
Dale Kramer, who was the Chief Revenue Estimator under Bob Bullock, the youngest Chief Revenue Estimator in our state's history, and I have worked together on tax policy for the last 3 or 4 years. And we've had this conversation. When I was a young county chairman, looking at my courthouse, began to ask, how much should that undesignated general revenue fund be?
Right.
And most folks that I have talked to in the realm of municipal or local government accounting will say that they believe it's prudent for government to keep about a quarter's worth of expenditures in that reserve fund.
Annual expenditures?
Yeah, about 3 to 4 months worth. Well, if you do 3 to 4 months worth in Texas, that's $25 billion.
Right.
And so when we're talking about having 8 or 10 in that fund, I think you really have to say, is that sufficient? We're talking about the fund is flush and we're going to, divert it over here and divert it over there. Is it really, if we truly have a need to stabilize us from some economic calamity, the Economic Stabilization Fund, is $8 billion enough? And when Dale and I had that conversation, he said, Debra, we've never needed that much I hear you, and I know at the local level we do 25%, but this is also a very large economy that has the, you know, when one segment suffers, other ones tend to be doing well. And so he felt like in the neighborhood of 10 to 12 billion was probably reasonable. I raised at your forum, should it all be invested the way that it's invested? The way that the Texas Safekeeping Trust Company within the Comptroller's office can invest that money is pretty limited, pretty restricted. And maybe there are some safer investment vehicles than those that are currently available to that fund. So I think we ought to be looking at that
Okay.
as well.
What's your opinion of franchise tax, and how would you change it?
When you start talking about reforming the tax structure, you really quickly get to that place that I mentioned earlier where you recognize 55% of the total state and local tax burden in Texas is borne by businesses. So when you look at that a little bit further, you also would probably recognize some huge inequities in that, and the franchise tax is a big part of that inequity. I can give you an example, there are 3 industries in Texas who each produce about the same amount of gross state product, right in the neighborhood of $100 billion a year. Utilities and transportation is one, finance and insurance is another, construction is the other. All 3 industries, roughly $100 billion in gross product in Texas a year. One of them pays $74 million a year in combined state and local tax, property, franchise, and sales tax. One of those industries pays $1.3 billion, and the other one pays $4.7 billion. Now, how, when you have 3 industries that are all producing essentially the same amount of gross state product, you have one paying $74 million in taxes a year and one paying $4 billion? The inequity in the system is really bad, and it's bad because the opponents in my race get a squeaky wheel that comes before the next legislative session and says, if you'll just give us this, we'll produce 50 jobs. Or we'll produce 300 jobs, or we'll do this for the economy. It's not the job of government to be in the investment banking business. When the job of government to be there on Prop 6, it's not the job of government to be there with regard to the franchise tax, but that's a lot of what the legislature has done over the last 10 or 15 years.
When you, as a comptroller, come in and make your recommendation, let's say on the franchise tax, and your recommendation, yeah, they think it's, oh yeah, but no, they're not gonna take your recommendation. What can a comptroller, what is your avenue to press? I mean, is it a legal series of things you gotta go to, or, I mean, once you recommend this, you're done, and if they don't accept it, then so be it.
You know, there are just a few statewide elected officials in Texas, the comptroller's one, and I think, I'm a registered nurse. Nurses are a big part of who we are as advocates for patients. Every citizen in the state of Texas ought to be somebody that the comptroller is advocating for, and you advocate by understanding what helps us achieve the ideas that are espoused in the Bill of Rights and in our own Constitution, that we would have a free and prosperous republic. That means having a conversation with our elected officials, but it also means having a conversation with the public. And while the comptroller's done a very good job, I think, particularly in the area of the reports on debt and the amount of debt that we have at the state level and at the local level, and making a lot of that fiscal spending transparent, unless you have hours to get into those weeds, I don't think we've exploited to the degree that we should the opportunity to talk directly to the public. The media wants newsworthy things, and if a state officer will speak with the press and with conservative radio and with all media, I think we're missing talking on Latin media. We don't do that. I was in the Univision station in 2009 asking a lot of questions. Univision, leading Latin television station in the state, in some markets, the leading station in that market. In San Antonio, it beats ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox. Univision's the #1 television station. It's probably, I think it's #2 in the Dallas area. Huge market share. When I was in the Austin station, the program manager stopped me and he said, "Debra, I really appreciate you asking all these questions, but you're a young politician, very unlikely you're going to win this office. Why are you asking these questions?" And I said, "I think it's important that we have a dialogue with these communities, and I know that these stations, the Latin stations in particular, do a lot of community outreach. In some areas it's immunization awareness, in others it's literacy, it's financial accountability." The man said to me, "Do you know, you're here, you're just a candidate. Do you know Governor Perry's never once been in this station?" It broke my heart. We're not having a conversation, and the Comptroller needs to be having that conversation with the legislature, but also with the public. And I can't believe for a second that if we weren't reaching out to radio and television and newspapers in the state, that they wouldn't be covering that messaging. So I think there's a great opportunity to do op-eds and just be continually talking to people about what's happening.
Okay, we have time for, what, a couple more questions?
Well, it's about 26 after, and we should be about 5 minutes max.
Okay. Transportation. Gasoline taxes are being siphoned off, so we don't have enough money to build roads in Texas. So we have kind of a combination of public roads, toll roads, and a combination of both. What do you think is the best way, or how should both roads be funded in Texas?
I think we really have to prioritize, because I'm not sure there's any prioritization going on now. We have to prioritize what are the core functions of state government, and constitutionally, it's mandated the state will provide a free public education for the general dissemination of knowledge. I think most of us would agree that the state has a duty to, or has a core obligation to provide a means of transportation to promote that commerce, that business that we want people to be able to engage in. We've got to get back to pay as you go, and that isn't going to happen overnight. We have been at both the state level and the local level not paying as we go for much of anything. So we've got this tremendous local debt burden. I don't know if y'all recognize, when you look at just the state of Texas debt burden, we are 10th in the nation. Just the state's per capita debt burden. When you look at just our local debt burden, we're 2nd in the nation.
We have $2 billion in our county.
$234 billion across the state of Texas in local government debt, puts us 2nd per capita debt level in the country. So when you combine state and local, we're 5th. The state of Texas is 5th. You know, we are, most of us, outraged at what's going on in Washington, D.C. and how many generations ahead of us we're dumping this debt onto. We're doing the same thing right here in Texas.
Yeah, that's right.
So we really have got to get back to pay as you go, and I think the gas tax is probably, even if it weren't diverted, not currently sufficient to meet the transportation needs. We've got a lot of accounting gimmicks going on between regional mobility authorities and local governments and the state of Texas, with money being mishandled and misappropriated. TxDOT lost billions of dollars a couple of bienniums ago that there's no accounting for. So there are lots of agencies that need some rocks kicked over, and a comptroller who's courageous enough to put the truth out in front of the public, regardless of how difficult it might be to deal with that reality. You know, I don't think we need to tar and feather anybody, but the people have got to understand, the public has got to understand, the legislature's got to understand what's going on with our money, and right now, frankly, they don't.
Okay. Wrap up comments? Okay. You're closing.
Gosh, we've covered a lot of territory here today. It's hard for me to kind of pull all that back in. This office is a good fit for the work that I've done for well over 20 years. It's an office that if we had a strong, courageous, and bold leader, we could accomplish a lot of what probably every member in your organization wants to see happen. We want limited government, fiscal responsibility, so we're free to raise our families and run our businesses in the way that we best determine ought to happen. That requires someone to not only do the job, but also to have the courage to step up at a public microphone and talk about those ideas again, so that people have hope and a willingness to engage and produce. I think it seems like so much in our society is crisis-driven, that we are just downtrodden with the worries and the cares. If we were to recognize what limited government looked like, what a constitutional republic ought to be, even though we might acknowledge that we're far from there, we are still in the most productive state in the country, one that has an incredible amount of both human and natural resource, and an opportunity not just to lead Texas to prosperity, but to set an example for the nation and for the world. So I know that we know that opportunity exists. We don't get there by continuing a repeat of where we've been. We've got to get out of kind of this mediocre status quo and exhibit some of the courage that our founders did and lead. And I am ready to do that.
Got 3 more minutes.
I thought you said 2.
Oh, 5, up to 5.
The last, here's something.
There's a timer right here. It's up to you.
I'm okay.
Right.
Good.
I'd encourage you as comptroller to be willing to stand up and tell the legislature when they're doing a bad job, where finances are concerned. I haven't seen that. And so, like you said, they need to be told this.
You know, Harvey came up to me, Representative Hildebrand came up to me when I testified. Right at the end of this session, George Lavender introduced a bill that eliminates every tax in Texas. It was our bill that I worked on because we were trying to get to property tax elimination and we couldn't get down to the low rate he wanted to be at. And we said, well, you can do a much broader tax. It's actually a value-added tax model. This is not a good model for tax. People are not going to be receptive to it. It's the least distorting to an economic free market that there is. At any rate, I went in to testify on that bill. We wanted a committee hearing because it's the first thing that has to happen. It is not the right tax structure. I know it's not. But George said, we've got to have it, we've got to introduce it in order to get to the debate and get the stakeholders at the table to really start discussing this. And Harvey came up to me and he said, now Debra, every time you come here, you tell us all the things we're doing wrong. He said, I'm going to let you testify today, but could you not beat up on us quite so much? So I don't think you have to worry
I can see
about
what you and Brian
that.
have in common now.
I don't, you know, I would much prefer to be a good exhorter,
Oh, sure.
you know. Let's lift up where you're doing right and
Where legislators
applaud.
concerned, they exhort themselves all the time.
Well, I think of exhortation as both positive, you know, it's encouraging you to go and do better.
Yes.
Identifying where you're weak and where what we've done has not moved us in the direction we want to go. This and this and this isn't good. This this is good. And I'm ready to do that. So thank you
Okay.
for that
Appreciate your
encouragement.
time.
Thank you very much.
I'm really sorry I'm
Stopping
late.
by.
Thank you guys
Oh.
for getting me
Issue.
through.
We're used to traffic.
We understand, we live in
Yes.
this traffic.
Yeah, we live.
So you need, well, we don't need to elect our text dot officials.
Well, some of the things that are going on out here at the construction, I think that we ran into are a part of bad decisions.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to fix that.
And procrastination.
Yeah. So we appreciate, you're more than welcome to stay for our meeting.
I think I'm speaking.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
speaking.
Oh, okay.
I know, John.
I'm sorry, I missed it. Well, then, there you are.
Did we have a sudden change of plans that we?
You know I've been buried in